And thank you very much to everybody in the MECS faculty and staff community. I really appreciate that you invited me. And I particularly appreciate even the latecomers who are here instead of attending the Christmas party in the Liebeskind building. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak about this. As Florian already alluded to, this is basically 3 stories woven in together. It's a story about simulations and serious games. It's also a little bit about the history of higher education since the 70s. And it's a little bit on the sidelines, a story about my experience with higher education administration, and how I went from here to here. So when we tell the story of this historical transformation of knowledge work from tabletops to screens, we always imply a history of administration, of management, of media technology. And the impressive career of administrative technology demonstrates the rise of bureaucratic controlling. And of course, the university has not been exempt from that trend since the 1970s. It also shapes what, for instance, Google recently called the cybernetic university, despite the apparent untimeliness of that phrase, because so late in the 20th century, cybernetics had seemed to fade away and merge into new perspectives. But Google is not alone in interpreting the computerization of academic administration as a reaction to growing pains in higher education and to functional differentiation under decades of neoliberal budget austerity. Still, some academic observers were caught by surprise by this cybernetic turn in higher education, since self-governance seemed so central and unbureaucratic and an academic tradition. The volunteer character, especially in European academia, of university administration had long remained unprofessional, and professors did not think of comparing their organization to corporate organizations and the metrics of efficiency and productivity. But for several reasons, the 1970s were a turning point in academic administrative culture, buffeted by the demographic and political drivers of enrollment growth and budget austerity. University management is also transformed by information technology and by a rapid series of punishing reforms that reduce the autonomy of higher education as a social institution. And we all know this, so I'm not going to depress you by reading another page about that. I'm going to try to skip to the consequences of this. The legacy of the academic autonomy that was shrinking, this partial self-determination of professors, of departments, of research centers, schools, and other parts of the university, having been hollowed out, has to do with the aftermath of an expansion of academia after the Sputnik shock, and then an expansion of national research funding almost everywhere, but also an expansion of enrollment, and then the collapse of public funding. So as a study of complex systems increasingly relied on computer models also from the 70s on, it was only a matter of time until academic administration was also included in this. The growth of systems modeling was made possible by machines that could instantiate observed or posited characteristics of natural or social systems. Wouldn't it be nice, these experts said, if you could drive the future before you wrote a check? This question is always one about organizational simulation and whether it adequately models an organization's culture, a set of key characteristics, including its values and its policies and its norms and the behaviors of key constituencies. What makes learning organizations complex is that they face difficult dynamic decisions, responding to contingency without complete information. Simulation models seek to reveal, in a controlled way, the result of interacting dynamics and create synthetic scenarios that can be analyzed, whether in real time or after a few run-throughs. I did not capture video from the game that I want to talk about. I'm going to just go with stills because I couldn't figure out how to show you slides and run an emulator for Windows 95 at the same time and toggle back and forth. But before we get to Virtual U, the game I want to talk about, I'll just point out very quickly that there's also a software history, a hardware history behind that. Advances in organizational simulation were inspired also by the visions laid out, for instance, in Apple's Knowledge Navigator from 1987. I'm assuming that most of you have seen that, or of course, Starfire by Sun, both inheriting elements from Alan Kay's work on the Dynabook. But I just want to mention that it's not a coincidence that the Knowledge Navigator from 1987, which is widely credited not only with the invention of assistants like Siri, Alexa, Cortana, but also other advances in data visualization and interface cultures, that this video, this visionary ad for Apple, shows a professor handling office tasks and research and preparing a lecture. And so, it's his personal assistant, of course, still has a bow tie. I was looking for the bow-tied MECS assistant that would help me with this task, but there isn't one. Only a decade later, in 1997, science advisor and systems analyst Jesse Ausubel publicly presented a vision for, quote, simulating the academy. Colleges and universities, he posited, are complex and arcane, unquote, not well understood at a systems level, even by those who live and work inside them. At the time, Ausubel was a program officer at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and he outlined his vision for a simulation of higher education administration. I quote, "Lack of understanding mattered less when the academy was held in high esteem and resources flowed to it at rates sufficient to maintain internal stability, but times have changed, the gleam of the ivory tower has dulled. A growing number of critics now believe that while educational services are central to America's successful future," sorry for the American-centric perspectives in a lot of things that I quote. I'm trying to quote European text as well, but a lot of it is going to be about American academia. "A growing number of critics now believe that while educational services are central to America's successful future, existing colleges and universities are failing to adequately manage their affairs." Clearly, the answer is not necessarily something like the Dynabook, but something just much more systematic. The structural transformation that people are observing in the 80s and 90s gave rise very soon to the modeling of higher education as a system of inputs and outputs with feedback characteristics. And it was only a couple years later that Stanford administrator William Massey announced that misconceptions about higher education abound, and these adversely affect the higher education policy environment and the institution's ability to govern themselves, end quote. And since Massey on the West Coast and Ausubel on the East Coast independently had conceived of the idea of a simulation of higher education as a proper response to all the problems, they teamed up to produce a university simulation game together with Enlight Software of Hong Kong, led by Trevor Chan, designer of games like Capitalism, 1993, and Capitalism 2 in 2001, as well as working with Digital Mill of Maine, led by Ben Sawyer, who's quite a serious proponent of serious games and co-founder of the Serious Game Initiative and the Games for Health project. So they programmed in C++ for a Windows environment, a title that would become Virtual U. And here on the right, you'll see the programmatic talk by Jesse Ausubel and William Massey and others, where in a book called What Higher Education is Doing Right, they're laying out the program for such a game. Before I show you something from the actual game, originally it became available for Windows 95 and then 98 and then NT. There was a second version that was distributed for free just a few years later as a download, version 2.0 for Windows 2000 and XP. It's, of course, extant on the Stanford University website. Let me sketch a little bit more of the background that led to the development of this remarkable simulation game. Of course, institutional research has long produced data and selected representations of data about our higher education. Before we wonder who is the intended audience or customer for a game like this, before we take a look at its structures, its affordances, it's worth tracing the intellectual arc that led Massey and Ausubel and others to assemble a team that would implement a game that looks like this. Again, I apologize for not having gameplay video. It's very exciting. Breathtaking action. All joking aside, it implements data from the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, and it implements decades of research by William Massey, who is not only a professor of education and administrator at Stanford, but had been compiling and collaborating with people at the University of Pennsylvania, at Yale, at other universities, mostly research universities, mostly private universities in the United States. Together with co-authors, his efforts to formulate already in the 70s a cybernetic administration for higher education can be studied in a massive book, a 600-page book, published in 1981 called Planning Models for Colleges and Universities. And in that book he discusses at length the implicit and explicit mental models, the use of words, graphs, other representations, synthesizing as much of known facts as possible within the given reference system. And Massey states plainly, I quote, that planning models are products of modern decision science. And even though on the first page they warn, we are wholeheartedly opposed to the notion of quantitative modeling as a substitute for the kind of quantitative decision making that is the essence of academic leadership, nonetheless they provide another 600 pages that really try to automate a lot of administration, try to put it into feedback loops, into cybernetic processes. So models, they warn, must not only be verified or shown to have been constructed as a design required, but validated to test whether the degree of approximation to the reference system is adequate. That's really, that latter question is what's going to guide my discussion of virtual U based on my experience with higher education in 3 different countries and different roles as a student, as a researcher, as a professor, as an administrator. So this college simulator draws on 3 concurrent developments. Management education games, increasingly in use in management education, special purpose simulations developed for enterprises from nuclear plants to military tactics, etc. And of course, later on, commercial interactive entertainment software of the type that includes successful titles like SimCity, SimHealth, SimEarth. Significantly, those kinds of games use continuous computation, graphics, and sound to sustain user interest. There's not a lot of sound in here, but it's an early title. They make individuals play against the model, and that's the case here. You play as the president of a university, you get to decide what type of institution that is, and you play against the baked-in assumptions of the model. Massey and Ausubel, in their idea for this, lay out that they're drawing on management science, on operations research, and trying to make that apply to the university. There are other books, of course, that have proposed a cybernetic administration model for a university. There's one book by Birnbaum that explicitly warns that, quote, external political or bureaucratic forces may point to obvious institutional shortcomings and demand correction without understanding either the existing benefits for which they are a trade-off or the significant costs to be paid elsewhere in the institution for improving them. So just because you have new management techniques, he's saying, in cybernetics and management, doesn't mean that that's going to improve the university. Nonetheless, Hopkins and Massey point to an early presentation by Dartmouth president, mathematician John Kemeny in 1972, who called for systematic modeling of colleges and universities and their administration. He mentioned faculty appointment and promotion rates, departmental allocations, academic program options, and the relation between endowment yield and capital spending as things that can be modeled by computer. Notably absent from that vision from 1972, but not totally absent here, is representation of student enrollments, of graduation rates, of attrition. So Hopkins and Massey learned from that, 1972 to 1981. They understand that while faculty staffing models may include aggregate factors such as age distribution, tenure ratios, or workload measures, I quote, "There have been no successful efforts to model comprehensively the two most crucial areas of decision that must be faced by academic administrators. The first of these is the choice of academic disciplines in which the institution should try to excel, what mix of faculty appointments in particular disciplines and specialties will be needed. The second is the choice of criteria and measures for evaluating individual faculty members for appointment and promotion." So these two honestly propose that the computer is going to help you decide who to hire, who to fire, who to keep, who to not keep. So Virtual U also makes an effort to model this demographically. There's certain assumptions. I'm going to get back to the 7 modules that are sort of underlying the software. And of course, it stands to reason that planning, programming, and budgeting is tractable to spreadsheets, to graphs, computer models, predictive modeling, management information systems, etc. But it is becoming palpable that the resource allocation is not enough. It's not just about budget models. So Hopkins and Massey, in putting together their book for 1981, had a survey of 96 colleges and universities and asked them, where do you see a potential for using computers, or where do you already use computers? And surprisingly, there was booking rooms. That was first the test case for how computers can be useful to administrators. By the time Virtual U comes out, however, they want to include everything that an administrator has to think about, including even the students. So they analyze an applicant's pool size and composition, which enables a prediction of yield rates and which kind of students are going to go to this institution. Are they blue chip, scholar, extracurricular, athlete, balanced, average, or stretch applicants? Which is a polite way of saying, are you getting the kinds of students that you hope for, that your faculty hope for? And then you can model the segment sizes and the yield preferences of the institution informed by longitudinal data from US higher education. And then if you look into the strategy guide for this game, you can download it. I'm sorry, it's not very legible, but searchworks.stanford.edu will give you the software to download, but also, perhaps more relevantly, a strategy guide for the 2 versions of the game that recommend to the player various approaches to using the game to learn something about higher education administration. The strategy guide boasts that Virtual U uses a number of mathematical techniques that are quite advanced for simulation games at the time. They use linear programming for faculty hiring. They use quadratic programming in student admissions and the central budgeting regime. And they use certain probability models to determine sponsored research proposals and awards. So the simulation game Virtual U lets you play as the president of a college or a university. You can decide what type of institution that is. You choose how faculty spend their time, allocate their funds, decide if you should give special admissions to athletes. You set institutional and departmental budgets as a way to make decisions over hiring and compensation, as well as enrollment management, facilities, parking. Parking is very important to university presidents. The first version was sold on a CD-ROM, playable, like I said, on Windows 95 or 98, and then the downloadable version 2.0 played on Windows XP or Windows 2000, and it added some features. The game development was supported by the Sloan Foundation, where Ausable worked, a fact that I'll have to come back to in discussing the roles of foundations in this. Matthey later admits in an interview, while virtual U is necessarily a caricature of real academic life, it is grounded in authentic conceptual structures. The president player faces certain standard scenarios, such as balancing a budget, increasing faculty salaries, improving pedagogy, boosting research, winning athletic competitions, controlling tuition increases, enrolling more minority students, etc. In addition, the president can also confront chance events, for instance, a governor making a sudden change in higher education appropriations, Congress adjusting research funding, or some serious scandals or accidents on your campus. As the virtual use strategy guide also makes clear, the simulation operates on 7 computing modules. They're basically invisible to the player, but they critically limit what the simulation allows you to do, what the simulation permits you to explore. The 7 modules are enrollment management, faculty hiring and retention, academic operations, non-academic operations, physical plant, resource allocation, endowment asset allocation. Each of them is programmed to work behind the scenes to inform the gameplay, and different institutions have baked in kind of limits on what's possible in them. For instance, enrollment management consists of application submissions, admission offers, matriculation decisions. The module always assumes that fewer people matriculate than receive admissions offers, and it has an implicit assumption about checks and balances in financial aid. Right? So right away you see this is the Stanford world, where the sticker price might be tens of thousands of dollars, but in order to allow a segment of the population that can't afford that, you return a lot of this tuition dollars to financial aid, so that you can give some people free tuition and some people pay partial tuition, etc. So virtual U does not necessarily show you the real world of public higher education or German higher education. It basically models Stanford best. Enrollment management also has implicit assumptions about what kind of financial aid there can be. Right? So there could be merit-based aid for academic excellence, there could be need-based aid for economic diversification, but for doctoral students, there's universal aid. So all PhD students, all doctoral students get funding from the tuition pot. Perhaps more intriguingly, the faculty hiring modules runs calculations in the background that limit what the player president can do in any academic year of playing. Right? So the rounds of the levels are academic years. It handles the probability of promotion of faculty from one rank to another, right, from assistant to associate to full professor, including their age, their service length, their research productivity, and it implicitly models the aging and departure of faculty. It also, in a non-academic operations module, the game reflects assumptions about how investment in library and information technology will affect the morale and work quality both of faculty and of students collectively. But as the strategy guide reveals, investing in information technology also affects the number of courses taught using distance technology and the university's attraction to distance students. Right? So again, 1998 calling for explicit transition of the Stanford model to online education. So without rehearsing the details of all 7 modules, what's crucial for you to understand in Virtual U, I'm forgetting to go to the next slides here. The president player's inputs include a target, setting a target, the relative importance of the target, and acceptable upper and lower limits are set by the software. Right? So you can't put all your resources into only one thing because they're all interconnected. And to that extent, it's valuable to see that, yes, you might think, I could run Leuphana better than the people who've been running it because I would put all my effort into this one thing. And the software reminds you that that's not realistic, that's not possible. There are some things that, some trade-offs to be made. Right, so here, interestingly, the simulation sets its recommended values to minimize an index equally to the weighted sum of squared deviations between values and the targets. Right, so whatever target I set as a president, there's software that kind of limits my gameplay target. So for instance, if I limit tuition growth, I set it to 2.5%, but I want to grow financial aid by 3%. And the financial aid target is declared twice as important as the tuition raises. Then there's an objective function in the game that deals with this that I forgot to put in a slide, but it mathematically models the relative importance of those. And then each year that you play, things grow in a certain direction. The model instantiates the accounting entities that require gameplay to always steer between acceptable bounds, as if your staff impose some kind of consistency in carrying out this target. As William Massey announced before the game was first released, the game operates through single or dual logistic response functions, classic S-shaped curves, or stacked pairs of S-shaped curves, which have been parametrized judgmentally. Parametrized? Whatever. I had to have that quote in there, but I don't know how to say it. Interestingly, also, the professors in the simulations progress from year to year according to a Markov process with transition possibilities to promote, depart, or continue in rank. The software also includes the possibility of assistant professors to stay and goes to 0 after 7 years. Right? So you've outstayed your welcome, you're not tenured, you're gone. And the probability for full professors to stay on declines rapidly after age 55. Right? So there's certain baked-in math in the game. Just as intriguingly, the simulation only knows about 2 issues that can delay a student's progression towards graduation. It could be a denial of entry into a course, or there could be a failure after the course has been taken. Other student life issues are not part of the simulation. As Massey put it in 1999, quote, supply-side effects derive from the faculty's preference for one or another teaching method, faculty size, and permissible teaching loads. Departments have a preferred teaching method mix, which the president may seek to influence. If we accept that reductive model, then we should perhaps not be taken by surprise, and Massey also stipulates that substantially larger class size limits for distance students stimulate a virtual learning environment. And of course, that's where a lot of things go, just as you saw in the Apple video from 1987, by 1997, 1999, everybody thinks that universities are going to go online. The Virtual U Strategy Guide and Massey's other publications on the game make it clear that the faculty's default settings require close attention to the trustees' annual evaluation letter, the final financial year-end statements, and the budget. Because obviously, you're playing the president. How can you lose this game? How can you win this game? We always assume that a game has to have a win condition or the possibility of losing. Well, it's the trustees who can fire you as president. So you can lose. That's not really a way that you win because you play against the model. You don't play against other universities. You don't compete as Stanford against everybody else. but you just play as long as you wish for a certain number of years. Different scenarios that the game offers have different lengths to play. So the official motivation for offering to the market a simulation game, originally for $80, then for $40, then for free, I wonder why, as the Serious Games developer Ben Sawyer, who worked on it, emailed me, was to hope that it would train department chairs and other part-time administrators in the faculty to step up to full-time administrative roles in this cybernetic university. As I said, Ben Sawyer is not just a serious game developer, he's also the founder of the Serious Games Initiative, a project of the US government's Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And he's one of the leading which is one of the leading organizations in the field of serious games. So when they won a couple of awards for this, journalists started digging in and saw that more than 15,000 faculty members and other representatives of more than 800 universities around the world had downloaded and used the first version of the software, which was recognized as one of the 10 best independently produced games at the 2001 Independent Games Festival. Like I said, justifies me torturing you with stories about virtual you. I'm not going to try to continue with the rant against online education and its hype. I'm going to try to skip that and go right into the particular scenarios that allow the performance evaluation for you as a player, the president. It's true that your performance evaluation depends on 4 factors. Right? There are academic output measures, such as graduations, publications. There are institutional performance indicators, such as how effective is the teaching, is the non-academic operation maintained. There's a metric for reputation, which is measured in rewards and grants, but also hard to measure. And then there's the financial status. Are you in debt at the end of the year or at the end of a multi-year period, or do you have a surplus? The model is weighted so that prestige is much more important than the other metrics, Stanford. And so that the percentage of alumni who donate in the past 5 years is as important as scholarship. And all of those metrics are twice as important as student diversity or faculty diversity. Right, so again, you can put the president's bonus points together with the ultimate score. The ultimate score is current trustee evaluation times the number of gaming years plus current trustee evaluation minus the initial trustee evaluation, so that you see whether you got better at your job or not, times 10, because it's in a decade, let's say, plus any kind of bonus points, and bonus points are specific to each scenario, like dealing with a crisis, winning athletic games, etc. So you have to wonder, who wants to play this game? Show of hands. Like I said, the emulator is running pretty clunkily, so maybe we have a Windows machine that still does Windows 2000 here in the office somewhere. You can download the game. But it's a serious question. Who is this designed for? Who do the developers anticipate? Ausubel and Massey wrote in 1997, before they tackled the realization of the software, that the target market for a college administration simulator would be higher education administrators and faculty in leadership roles. Again, those are apparently 2 different things. Right? That's what they say, administrators and faculty in leadership roles. So am I the only person who would pause at that? That's a weird distinction to make. I always thought that leadership could be faculty, but no. It explicitly assumes that full-time administrators are not, in fact, faculty members themselves. But it wants to recruit people to become those full-time administrators who are no longer behaving like professors. Because professors are just a cost driver, right? They're not the administrators who control the cybernetic university. Despite the promise that subsequent versions of Virtual U would allow tailoring the data set, because technically you could do this, it's open, you could enter different data for different countries or whatever, but it turns out it was too Stanford specific and too US specific to really allow that to different types of institutions. That would have made it perhaps more compatible with European or Australasian university types. That never happened. And despite an explicit admission in the training materials for Virtual U that the vast majority of board members hiring, supervising, and firing college presidents have themselves no meaningful experience with faculty or with higher education or with administration, they're just usually wealthy people who get to advise. The way to keep score in the game and to get decent evaluations from the Board of Trustees is basically to not go into deficit. That's the one thing that will get you fired. If after 10 years as a president, you're financially worse off. Even in 1997, the vision for the game was restricted mostly to that budget control vision, stating, quote, most of SimU's value, as they called it before it became Virtual U, will come from discussions about values, performance measures, and the functions programmed into the game. Right, so it's not that the game allows you to become a better administrator, it's that you're fighting against everything that's been coded into the game until you agree to play that the way that the game wants you to play. Right? We don't install ourselves in the model, we install the model in us. So if the focus was on efforts to get administrators to play the game and perhaps to get department chairs to start thinking about larger roles in administration, I asked several people who worked on this, would they now say, with hindsight, that it was an fictive training game? Is it a simulation that seeks to inculcate an open exploration of higher ed in the players, while at the same time allowing for an amount of contingency that allows students of higher ed to explore a virtual space for agency? Or is it in fact perhaps just a gamification title that strictly limits contingency because it has a very restricted model of what higher education is or how it works? To decide that, we need to look not only at the screens of the game and the decisions available in Virtual U and how they might compare to the interfaces used in actual current higher education administration, but also consider whether the assumptions baked into Virtual U actually bear out in university life as we know it since 1981 or since 1997 or more recently. Already in 1981, Massey asserted that a large part of the university's budget consists of faculty and staff salaries. He failed to mention their benefits. Right? It's weird because since 1981, benefits have been a much bigger burden on the budget of universities than salaries, right? Which is another way of saying salaries have stagnated. But benefits, that's where the rubber meets the road. So the first blind spot. They don't model inflation either. Granted, that's a little difficult to make predictions on where should inflation fit into your model, but it matters. Virtual U sets out to model how so-called productivity, whether it's measured in terms of enrollments or graduation or tuition revenues or publications or grants, cannot simply increase without affecting other parts of the system negatively. Right? So for instance, if a student-faculty ratio deteriorates, this must impact pedagogy and student satisfaction as well as faculty morale. And if tuition increases faster than the wage rate in the economy, then a university that you run here, that you play, may risk pricing itself out of the market. But most pre-programmed scenarios that the player sees offered in the game limit the time horizon in which such adverse impacts play out. Right? You play for 8-10 years, you don't really see all of a sudden you no longer get the students that you want. Keeping faculty pay low is great as a target for a president, for instance, by adding auxiliary and part-time instructors. But that also clearly affects educational quality as well as the reputation of the institution. And remember, prestige is the biggest factor that the trustees want to see because they're all about the bragging rights of the institution they're affiliated with. Various other assumptions from Massey's very diligent research over decades that clearly influenced the game design have turned out to be wrong, despite his awareness that, quote, much more needs to be known about prediction errors in his model. So for instance, he asserts that, quote, the university competes for many, if not most, of its staff employees in labor markets that are dominated by business firms. Today, that's clearly wrong. In the times of increasing specialization, staff who can work in university administration have to know legal precedents, federal regulations, financial aid systems, and other areas that are specific to academia and don't exist in an insurance company or a bank or whatever. Massey also surmised, quote, that it is doubtful whether the price of higher education can increase faster than wages indefinitely, even when significant sums are plowed back into financial aid. But that is exactly what has happened since then, which is why it now costs up to $80,000 a year, sticker price, to attend a private university in the United States. That's before living costs, that's just the tuition. Not housing, not food, not books, not computing, not commuting, not parking. Right? Finally, Massey already saw that, quote, more effort is required in designing the appropriate interface between the user and the computer program. Yes, you saw how dinky this looks now. That's not really something that we can fault Virtual U for, but how does it stack up in the context of serious games? We know that simulations can improve certain kinds of performance. We know simulations can be useful for training, which is different from learning. There have not been a lot of studies that document whether simulation games do much for real learning. There's some meta-studies quoted in this article, which is recent enough that I can put this up here on a slide. Game studies have been asking for a while now what the state-of-the-art instructional video game would look like. It would probably not look like Virtual U. The answers have been quite varied so far. There's been the well-known recommendation was to pick a domain of authentic professionalism well, intelligently select the skills to be distributed, build a value system integral to the gameplay, and relate instructions to specific contexts. Arguably, very few serious games really live up to that set of demands. But we've also come to accept that simulation games are not necessarily about the entertainment value, so do play Virtual U even though it's not going to reward you with a big win condition. But there's been a lot of studies, even quoted in here, that found that games can decrease opportunities for peer interaction and communication with instructors, in some cases even distracting students and hindering learning. Right, so despite the fact that this vision, this is from another book about cybernetic administration and of higher education, despite the fact that this cybernetic idea has decades of history, what you get in Virtual U really falls down when you compare it to other serious games, and really fails when you compare it to the needs in higher education for leadership that takes into account what the student experience is, what the political situation is, and what makes the quality of a university measurable. One study used Virtual U to examine the difference in academic and achievement between students who did and who did not play it. Right, so standard setup, adding the game to half the classes, teaching third-year management students at an East Coast university in the United States, administered standard tests afterwards, and compare in terms of mean score as well as any differentiation by gender, by age, by ethnicity among the students. The result, students who used the game did score slightly better on average, and there was no differentiation by gender, by ethnicity, or by age. One review of Virtual U argues that it's a challenging game that is, I quote, realistic enough to be used as an educational tool. Just as Capitalism Plus is still used in business schools worldwide, another game from the same developer, Virtual U is being used around the US to train professional university administrators and education students. So in a cynical mood, you could say, well, yes, There are a lot of these chance events that Virtual U throws at you if you play as a president, but the non-chance events, or it seems with hindsight, the events that have shaped the development in higher education, especially in the United States, were neither foreseen nor are allowed by the software. So you don't get to test, how would I play if I were, for instance, a visionary administrator like Clark Kerr, who led the University of California for a long, long time, and who knew much better than, I guess, the people who worked on Virtual U, that it comes down to things that are not necessarily easily booked into software, that it comes down to values, and that it comes down to not necessarily competing with for-profit universities, because they're in a completely different business. Another review of Virtual U quips that it may seem impossible to, quote, balance professors' dreams for a talented student body and a bigger research budget against students' desire for small classes and smaller tuition increases. It's true, the university simulator here does not allow you to make that balance. Right? If you're going to play the way the software forces you to play to increase the reputation of the institution, you cannot keep student tuition low. It's just not an option. You will fail. You will play again and again and fail again at Virtual U if you do not have high tuition increases. So it's fair to say that the simulation starkly models certain trade-offs and limits. Surely, just the act of placating stakeholders is not the hallmark of academic leadership. So as you study these kinds of models, everybody is studying the effectiveness, the efficiency. You see that what you really come away with playing Virtual U is a set of, confirming a set of beliefs that many professors already have, which is that there's growing perverse incentives in academia. Right? Ostensibly, you want to see researchers rewarded for an increased number of publications. What really happens is an avalanche of substandard publications. Ostensibly, you want to reward people for citations. What you really get is a proliferation of authors, of footnotes. Things that are clearly wrong get the most quotes, because everybody loves to say, look, this is wrong, and therefore it's going to be rewarded as if it was a great idea, etc., etc. So what Virtual U inadvertently, you could say, models is the logic of perverse incentives in academia, including the idea that Virtual U, this is a different Virtual U he's talking about the New York Times recently, the coming of age of online education. No. So why do I torture myself and you for almost long enough now with the long or not so long history of Virtual U, the game, and of academic planning? Because for my sins I suffered, as Florian said in the beginning, in the moments of crisis for several years as the chair of the University Committee in Planning and Budget for the University of California, which is the largest public university on this planet, and trying to balance the various consistencies in their demands after 2008, the financial crisis, and trying to survive as an institution without hurting staff or students or faculty or the campus organizations too much. If you want to read about that, it's a thoroughly depressing document that nonetheless I have to figure as a co-author of. It's posted online, the University of California Commission on the Future final report. And there's a follow-up report that shows you what became of the various recommendations that all of us faculty representatives tried to prevent from going out to the public. Luckily, some of the recommendations didn't go anywhere. But of course, we all know we did not manage to limit tuition increases. We did not manage to limit other factors that have made higher education difficult in the United States and elsewhere. And I'm not alone in looking at this. There's like from long, long ago to very recently. There's plenty of other books. Some of them all-out rants about the fall of the faculty, and others are more balanced portraits of what happens under the conditions of the new administrative university. But I will leave you with that and give a little bit of time for questions or for early departures to the Christmas party. Or you can always pretend that you're going to download Virtual U right now from the Stanford website. Richard Massey is retired now, and so is Jesse Ausubel. Richard Massey got to start his own think tank. And if we had 2 more hours, we could talk about how think tanks play a role in this whole story, advising the universities. In the case of the University of Columbia, we invented our own in-house think tank. But think tanks are just as guilty, consulting companies are just as guilty of perpetrating several crimes against higher education. And we could also look at what Jesse Ausubel does and did when he was a foundation officer. Some very, very interesting things to do with serious games, including inspiring SimCity to become much better, etc. But questions, comments, ideas? Thank you.